So the polls keep coming in demonstrating that there is a growing political, dare I say, ideological divide taking place between young men and young women in this country. But whereas there's always been differences between men and women, and typically differences with respect to what they vote or individual instances of what they might value, generally speaking, the question that we have to ask ourselves now is what we're witnessing going way beyond what we might call typical political differences or preferences? Are we actually wading into the arena where men and women consider themselves enemies, especially young men and women? We've already discussed before how marriage is essentially dropped off a cliff. And because of these ideological divides that we're starting to see, and because of the way that men and women are answering questions on polling, it's not hard to come to the conclusion that there might be a whole lot more animosity than we've seen in the past. So today what we're going to do is we're going to review some of the polling that has been taken that has asked both men and women very important questions about their outlooks, not just on politics, but on life, on marriage, on having kids. We're going to ask ourselves, do we see a real crisis here? And I don't mean the same sort of crisis that everyone's been talking about. I'm talking about genuine animosity. All that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well.
Okay, so we've dabbled with this issue quite a bit on the growing divide between young men and young women. But some recent polling has come out which has demonstrated that this is not what it's been in the past. That there's something a lot more deep-seated. There's, especially among young men, an incredible amount of frustration and a backlash that is, I used to say it was brewing. I think it's here. And the numbers seem to demonstrate that. So let's go to like the first poll here. So what we're going to do is we're going to frame this up. We're going to let everyone know exactly what we're talking about so we can all be on the same sheet of music as we then discuss the different perspectives involved here, what young men are seeing, what older men are seeing, what women are looking at. And we can try to kind of make sense of all this and answer the question, is it too late? Like, is the backlash coming in such a way to where it's going to get bad? Or is there a way to actually salvage what I think everyone at this table believes is the important and cooperative nature between men and women? So what's the first poll we're going to look at, Christian?
So I've got some crazy stats to go through with you guys. This first link that we've got up here is a poll that was recently conducted by Pew Research. Mm-hmm. And it shows the age and gender divide in terms of party identification. Now, what's crazy about this, twofold. First one, the biggest gender gap is with 18 to 29-year-old voters when you look at female versus male. The second one is when you look at how Republican-leaning 18 to 29-year-old men are as a percentage of the entire population. You could argue that 18 to 29-year-old men are more to the right than any other group in the entire country. When you look, again, when you subtract Democrat from Republican here. So here's the breakdown. You've got 34% of 18 to 29-year-old men identify as Democrats. 52% identify as Republicans. And I wonder what this 13% is. Maybe they think the Democrats are too far to the left. Yeah. Something tells me that's not the case in this instance, especially because that's actually the highest percentage of all of this. And then on women, the most loyal Democratic constituency in America is 18 to 29-year-old women. In fact, it's the only one, with the exception of 30 to 49-year-old women, where an absolute majority of the group identifies as Democrats. It's 58% of them say that they're Democrats, and only 37% say that they're Republicans. So the gender gap here is significantly larger than the gender gap among, say, boomers, right? 65 and up.
And by the way, this was put out in June of 2025. It was February 5th to June of 2025.
Yeah, basically over the spring of this year. And so this was thousands of respondents. This was a pretty high quality poll that conducted this. Again, when you look at like the older generations here, like 65 and up, men, it's really like R plus 14, right? 55 minus 40. And in women, it's like D plus 3.
Yeah. Yeah, women 50 to 64, it's 46 Democrat, 46 Republican. 65 plus, it's 47% Democrat, 44 Republican. This is for women. 30 to 49, 53, 39. So that's a bigger gap. But then 18 to 29, 58 to 37, it's the biggest gap. And again, it's the biggest gap between women, young women and older women, and it's also the biggest gap between young women and young men. Because if you look at all these other categories, what you see is that, yes, there is a divide between men and women. Men tend to be more Republican. Women tend to be more Democrat. But here's the difference, just to give everyone an idea. With 30 to 49, women are 53 Democrat, men are 51 Republican. So that's your differential, not a ton. 50 to 64, men are 56 Republican, women are 46 Republican. Or 46 Democrats. So again, it's not a huge, I mean, it's sizable, it's noticeable. And then when you get into 65 plus, men are 54 Republican, women are, 44 Republican or 47 Democrat. So again, it's noticeable, it's statistically noticeable, but it's not some like massive gap that really causes a great deal of concern. You could probably, most people would sit down and be like, yeah, I can explain that through a variety of different things. But 18 to 29, that's significant. So right off the bat, what we can conclude here is that not only is there a massive divide between young men and young women, 18 to 29, but that divide seems to be growing.
To put it another way, the gender divide of 65 and up is about 14, 15, it's 17 points. Between men and women. Mm-hmm. Between 18 to 29-year-olds, it's 39 points in terms of the difference between where women are and where men are. That's huge. Again, like no other generation is like that. And on the men's side, young men here are just, in terms of net Republican, are just as Republican as their Gen X parents.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, when we think of the most Republican demographic in America, we typically think of, I mean, it actually is this, like 50 to 64-year-old men. I do when I think of that.
Yeah.
Well, 18 to 29-year-old men are 1 point less.
Yeah.
I mean, statistically, it's identical to 50 to 64-year-old men. So,
wait.
Well,
I see 52% to 56.
I'm subtracting. You have to do net, right? You're
okay.
taking the Republican respondents minus the Democrat respondents.
I
Think
got
about
you.
it this way.
Okay.
The least democratically out of this entire cohort, the least Democratic leaning cohort in America is 18 to 29-year-old men.
Yeah.
In terms of the smallest percentage.
Yeah, the smallest. There are, because again, the important part to remember here is they're asking Republican versus Democrat. I guarantee you when we look at the no, lean, or refuse to respond, the 13% of men, it is most likely not because they lean more liberal, they just don't think the Democratic Party is left enough for them. It's probably because you have some people that go, no, the Republicans are not right enough for me. That's where the trend suggests.
And conversely, when you're talking about women, there is a bit of a taboo for women to be Republicans. And so women tend to be fine with identifying as a Democrat. They tend to be much more touchy about trying to identify as a Republican. I'll give you an example. My stepmom, Democrat for life. Now she says she's neither.
Yeah.
But she's been voting for Republican for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So
my mother has said the same thing.
Right.
And she has voted Republican in basically every election since like 2004.
But they won't identify themselves that way still.
Mm-hmm.
And so
there's still a social stigma attached to it.
So there is certain things where it might be a little more of a social stigma to identify yourself as a Democrat as a man. But the opposite is true for women.
Oh, there's definitely a stigma. So point is that there's a gender divide that's emerging.
Yeah.
And it's not just Pew. I actually have a clip from an interview from Ezra Klein from the New York Times, of all people.
Yeah.
Who's not a conservative, to put it lightly. But he had this sit-down interview, and we've briefly gone over a few points in this in older podcasts.
Yeah.
But there's one data point in here that's different from some of the other stuff that I want to show you guys. And just listen to this for a second.
to describe
This
it.
chart in some ways convinced me to do this podcast.
Oh, thank you.
This chart shocks me.
I agree. This is, to me, the scariest chart in this entire presentation. And again, something I'm very surprised by. On the bottom, we have age. And at the top, we have the gender gap in support between women and men. And, for support for Kamala Harris. And so what you can see is that, for voters over 30, the gender gap was fairly stable at around 10%, which is roughly where it's been in American politics.
And voters over 75, it's even lower.
That's right.
It's a fairly low gender gap among older voters.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, underestimate how recent the gender gap is. Historically, Republicans did better with women than men. And, this was true across most of the West, that center-left parties did better with men than women. And, that's changed in the United States in the Clinton era. But, it's been stable since then. But what's crazy is if you look at people who are under the age of 30, the gender gap has exploded. If you look at 18-year-olds, 18-year-old men were 23 percentage points more likely to support, Donald Trump than 18-year-old women, which is just completely unprecedented in American politics.
Is that
So there's something to keep in mind here as we look at all of these, like Pew Research and whatnot, and the reason why this chart is very important. Pew Research allowed to keep doing this 18 to 29. But if you actually back it up a little bit, and you start going to
just 18 or
18 or 20 or 18 to 22, all of a sudden it varies significantly. And I would also say that we've also seen some other polling which demonstrates that when you separate like young white women under the age of 20, I think actually broke for Donald Trump. Yeah. So there's an interesting dynamic there with how even women are dividing when you narrow your view to just 18 to 20 as opposed to 18 to 29. But
you're right that on the 18 to 29-year-olds is a broad swath of people because by the time you're at 29, you're almost at my age, right? Whereas 18 is like younger than my siblings.
Oh, yeah.
And
18, I had just graduated high school and joined the military. 29, I was the father of 3, right? Like that's a lot of life.
But what's interesting
Allie's about to be 18. So you think about it. Our youngest child, Allie, versus,
versus me.
Yeah.
well, actually, it would be versus our son-in-law, who is 29.
Yeah.
And so
that's a big difference.
That is a huge gap.
And so when you look at the 18 to 25-year-olds versus the 25, like if you take really the Zoomers and you split them into, technically 29 is still youngest of the millennials, but when you take, Zoomers and Zillennials, right? And you look at the younger cohort versus the older one, the gender gap, it just explodes here. Again, like I've frozen the video just to show this chart here.
Yeah.
The biggest divide is among the youngest of the voters. When he said that it was, 18-year-olds had a 23 percentage point difference between how men voted versus women.
Yeah.
And by the way, that difference was in favor of Trump. It wasn't like the women were, yes, they were disproportionately Democrat, but it's actually the older Zoomers and younger millennials that, in terms of the women group that were more Democrat leaning, whereas the 18 to 20-year-olds were like you said, they did narrowly vote for Trump. Whereas like if you get into say 25 to 30, they voted for Harris.
Well, I think the strange phenomenon here again is it's the old Churchill quote. Like for as long as I can remember, if you're old and not a conservative, you have no brain. If you're young and not a liberal, you have no heart. And so the idea is that younger voters were always more convinced by what we might call left-leaning or liberal-leaning arguments when it came to public policy. And
so did they have no heart?
And so and I'm sure some people are going to argue that, but what we're seeing is that young men, and this is the other part that I don't think people understand, because I was a 90s kid, and because I remember the original war on women that the Democrats always talked about, and this idea of the Democrats really positioning themselves to be the party of women. I think most people would shock them to know that for the longest time, women actually, on the whole, broke toward Republican or more conservative politics. And there's a number of ways that you could probably explain that. Some of them might have had to do with maybe law and order components or stuff like that.
Well, I do think that women in large part, I mean, you go back and I mean, it's the same reason why women were really big in the temperance movement is because there was an element of virtue that women were kind of the people in society who presented virtue. Virtue was more of a feminine quality in the past. Like a woman's virtue was incredibly valuable. And as virtue became less valuable and we started just destroying virtue as a society and not holding women up to that anymore and basically causing women or basically telling women that they need to be inferior men. And I think that as we destroyed virtue in women, they abandoned it and now they're going the route of
I have a theory,
feel like
but I'm going to hold it.
Sexual liberation and all of that, and the ability to kill your offspring, all of these things have caused women to.
Well, no, I agree, and I think there's some things that we can talk about when we get into perspectives and analysis that explain this. But like just from the framing perspective, the impression that I always had growing up was women tend to be more liberal and men tend to be more conservative. But the data does not play that out over history. And it's important for people to understand that so they can appreciate the gap that is taking place now and the nature of why the gap is taking place.
There's a couple more things that I want to briefly go through just to drive this point home some more.
Yeah.
This made the rounds on Twitter over the summer. You've probably seen this before, but in case our audience hasn't, I wanted to show it up, bring it up to them. This is a Gallup poll, so it's different from Pew. And it's showing the same thing in terms of.
And this goes to 2023.
Yeah, it goes from 1999 to 2023. So it's a little bit dated, but it goes far enough back, and that's the reason I wanted to show it to people. This is the political identification of, again, 18 to 29-year-olds over time. Mm-hmm. And when you look at men, I mean, according to Gallup, there's a lot of variation here, but according to Gallup, they've been basically, nowhere since the 90s. It's women that have just flown off a cliff in terms of being far more liberal, right? The axis here, is as you go higher, you're more liberal, and as you go lower, you're more conservative.
Yeah.
Now,
if you look at where men were in 2000, they were right at about plus 10 more conservative. If you look where they were at in 2023, they were like plus 5 more conservative. Yeah. If you look at where women were at, in 1999 or 2000, they were about plus 3 more liberal. And if you look at where they're at right now, they're about plus 19 more liberal. So drastic. Again, it's not as if all the way up until 2023, young men and women were both going in opposite directions. It's that men had remained fairly steady. The most conservative they've got, according to this chart, was in about 2003, 2004, where they were about plus 12 conservative. And by the way, around that time, women were about plus 3 conservative. And then the departure really kind of starts to take off to where now you got this 23-point gap. But men kind of always stayed within that probably average of about plus 5 conservative. Women, it looks like all the way up until about 2013, were probably about a plus 5 liberal. And then from 2013, 14 on, women just got increasingly more and more liberal.
But you know what's interesting? This goes only up to 2023.
Yes.
Here's what's happened since 2023.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the definitions of liberal versus conservative be a bit different as well throughout that period? So women breaking for Republicans, Democrats basically weren't all that different aside from fiscal issues.
Yeah, I mean, you to a degree, you have a point in terms of like
the Great Awakening explains
the Great Awakening explains a lot of it. But remember, that previous chart only goes up to 2023.
Yeah.
This is what's happened since 2023. I pulled 2 separate Pew polls here. This one is, again, the one that we saw earlier, 2025. And this one was
here. Go back to the other screen you had, because I think your tweet does a better job of kind of explaining it. So 18. So this is interesting. This is from 2023 to 2025. So we're now covering the gap that existed in the previous chart. So to give you an idea, 65 plus women went D+2. So they became more liberal, or excuse me, not more liberal. They just plus 2 on how they voted. 65 plus men, D plus 6. So older men actually had the biggest shift toward the left.
Boomers as a whole, both men and women, moved to the left.
Okay, then you get into 50 to 64-year-old men and women. Women went R plus 1, men went R plus 3. Then you get to 30 to 49-year-old women, they went D plus 3. So the most liberal swing was among women between the ages of 30 and 49. 30 to 49-year-old men went R plus 15. And now here's the big one. 18 to 29. 18 to 29-year-old women went R plus 14, right? So that's a big shift. But 18 to 29-year-old men, R plus 44. That is unprecedented. I mean, that's enormous.
We've never seen anything like this.
That's enormous.
So, okay, when I see a chart like this, it definitely causes my brain to want to go, why in the world would these older people shift left?
Well,
Except, I guess I'll bring that up
when we get into
Okay.
perspective.
we're really trying to depend on Tina's brain to be able to remember what she was gonna say.
So again, we got that, but here's the deal. All of this so far has been political in the sense of partisan politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, I think we've made the case, right? Men, you could argue over the last 2 years, both men and women have shifted more to the right, but men have shifted toward the right in like exponentially larger numbers the younger that they are. So, okay, we've established that, but this next graph is where we get into the way young men feel about issues like, quote, gender equality.
Yeah. So, I mean, if this didn't shock you, the R plus 44, wait until you see this. This is a study that was recently done that interviewed American boys in grades 8 to 10. So this is high
middle
school and middle school. And not even like late high school, right?
So these are 8th graders, freshmen, and sophomores.
Yes. And these are like, if you were to ask these questions, like from my perspective, when I was in high school, if you were to ask these questions, 15 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
I feel like that people would have given a very different answer than what they got here.
Yeah.
These are not historically super controversial questions if you think about it. Here's the first question. A woman should have the same job opportunities as a man. Here's the percentage of people who agree. This is 8th grade to 10th grade boys. Mm-hmm. The number who agree completely versus agree partially. And 2018 is when it peaked for all of this. It peaked in 2018. And you could argue that in some ways that was the immediate lead up to the peak of the Great Awakening.
So 8th and 10th grade boys in 2018, 84% said that they generally agreed with that. 63% said that they completely agreed with that. Completely. And now think about this for a moment, right? Because you got to think about two things here. Women should have the same job opportunities as a man. You're also thinking about jobs like the infantry, special forces, should women go to ranger school, right? So
everything.
There's an important distinction that needs to be made here between this kind of generalized idea of equal access to opportunity versus certain jobs that were probably highly dangerous or very, very unique in their job requirements, and that traditionally had not given equal. When I was in the military, women could not join the infantry. They could not go to ranger school. They could not be in special forces. Now they can do all of these things. Okay. And I left the military in 2009. So in 2018, at the height of it, 84% of 8th to 10th grade boys would say, yep, I generally agree with that. 63% would say, I completely agree.
A supermajority, effectively.
Yeah. In 2023,
this is up to
18. By 2023, 72%. So you had a 12-point drop in the number of boys that agreed with that concept at all. You had a 45% drop in the number, it dropped from 63 to 45% on the number of boys who said, I completely agree. So you had massive drops in the number of 8th to 10th grade boys that said a woman should have the same job opportunities as a man. But it didn't stop there. It was also men and women should be paid the same money if they do the same work. This had been, again, the height in 2018 was 87% of 8th to 10th grade boys said, yep, I generally agree with that. 72% said, I completely agree with that. That has now dropped to 79% and 57%. So it went from 72 to 57% among 8th to 10th grade boys that said, I completely agree with women being paid the same money if they do the same work. What is crazy about this is that you would assume with all of the drive, with all of the push, like they were already that, because this chart, if you go back to it, this goes back to 1990. So they're tracking numbers from 1990.
We're at the lowest levels on all of these questions since the data began to be collected.
Yeah, since
before I was
1990.
even born.
Yeah, since 1990. All right. So I was 11. All right. I was 11.
I was -4.
This is again the lowest with 8th to 10th grade boys. I mean, you think about that, that's decades. That is decades of essentially education that was uniquely geared toward ensuring that everyone in our society believed these things. Like these were considered to be unassailable moral truths.
Yeah.
And to not agree with them was tantamount to being socially ostracized. Like there was something wrong with you if you didn't believe this. And now we're seeing the highest numbers since
ever
saying
no. And again, the phrasing of these questions is almost presented in a way that is trying to get to 100% acceptance.
Yes.
On these questions.
Yeah, because they're not,
and yet not even half.
They didn't say should women serve in combat arms jobs within the military.
Same job opportunities
as
men.
a man. No.
They're trying to make it sound the most, bland egalitarian.
Yes. Well, and look even this. Men and women should be paid the same money if they do the same work. That, again, that sounds obvious. Well, yeah, if two people do the same job, then of course they should get paid the same. And we're going to get into why we think boys are saying this, but this is what they're saying. Now, what's also interesting about this is the assumptions, right? Insofar as they've started to notice this trend with young men, there's been all these assumptions put out by the left on they're all incels, or they're all listening to Andrew Tate, or they're all, but they actually ask those questions. So
this is where, this was crazy.
Yeah.
But when you look at the type of things that they controlled for, it gets even crazier.
Yeah.
So, they're like, okay. It has to be the smartphones and the computers.
That's the manosphere on social media.
It's the manosphere. It's these toxic men on, it's these Nick Freitases, these Andrew Tates that are indoctrinating these young boys into hating women. So, they controlled for amount of time spent on social media. No difference.
Well, here's the
no
crazy.
difference at all.
It also seems that the boys who spent the least amount of time watching videos experienced the largest decreases in support for gender equality. So again, their explanation was, oh, I know what happened. You got all these kids listening to Andrew Tate say, what color is your Bugatti? And so, yeah, of course they've done that. Nope. The people that watched fewer, the people that spent less time on that.
How about watching video content?
Yeah.
It was inverse of what people were expecting.
Yeah.
The number of boys who spent the least amount of time watching videos online had the sharpest declines. For those who spent less than 2 hours a day watching videos online, they actually have fallen. Look at this.
10%
fallen
more.
off a cliff. Only 37% now agree. Whereas those who spend 4 more hours are at 47%. What's interesting is both groups are still at all-time lows.
Yes, both groups are at all-time lows. It's just the ones that watched the least amount of video content or the less amount of video content had a 10% drop on the first question, should women have the same job opportunities as men, and a 7% drop on the second question, which is men and women should be paid the same money if they do the same work.
Now you're saying drop compared to the other cohort.
Yes.
And I keep saying cohort a lot in this podcast,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But actually, look at where they were in 2018. It's just been a total implosion. They were at over 60% in 2018, and now that group is at 37% today.
Yeah. So the video
total
content,
inversion of what people were expecting.
So the video content, the manosphere, that doesn't explain it. And so next they're like,
it must be the video games.
It's the video. It's these gamers. It's the hostile gamer culture. If you look at groups like Sargon of Akkad and Carl Benjamin, like Gamergate was a big deal where, they weren't just pushing woke ideology into movies and cartoons. They were pushing it into games. And so it was like, okay, this is what it is. It's the gamers.
No.
Nope.
Those who spend the least amount of time gaming have the sharpest drop-offs in both questions. So then, of course, it must be, they're antisocial.
They're incels.
They don't have friends. No, we're going to get to that.
Oh, sorry. These are just anti-social isolation and lack of romantic relationships.
So this is just, do you hang out with friends, right?
Yeah.
So it must be they're antisocial, right?
Yeah.
That's why they hate women.
Yeah.
Because they don't have any friends. They don't go out. No, actually, those who do hang out with friends had the sharpest drop off.
Yeah.
Compared
So they
to
are social.
those that don't.
They're not antisocial.
Okay, so then it must be the incels, right?
That's
It
right.
Must be
They
the
just
incels.
keep getting rejected by girls, and that's why they've
This
adopted.
is the craziest one of all of them. I'm
Nope.
going to blow this up just to show it.
Yeah.
Though 8th to 10th grade boys who go on dates had a significantly sharper drop off in terms of support for these two relatively bland questions
Yes.
on gender equality than those who have never gone on a date with a
Yep.
woman.
So it's not the guys. It's not the guys listening to the manosphere. Like, that doesn't explain the drop. It's not the people playing, violent video games. That doesn't explain the drop. It's not the people that have no friends and never go out and do anything and feel isolated. That doesn't explain the drop. And it's not the guys that can't get a date, right? That doesn't
Quite
explain
the
the drop.
opposite.
In fact,
It's actually strongly correlated.
In fact, for each one of those categories, the inverse is true.
So basically, the date goes so badly that it pushes him further off the cliff.
We don't know that. We don't know that. What
well,
we know
his
is
exposure to women is turning him off
here's what
feminism.
That's one possible conclusion. But here's what we can surmise based off of the data that we have right in front of us right now, right? From the framing component of this. The left-wing explanation for who would give an answer like this was the lonely, isolated, can't get a date, playing video games, watching Andrew Tate male. Right? Those are the ones that would have what they would classify as this kind of misogynist view of women. In reality, it's the more social, going out on dates, watching less of the manosphere, and playing fewer video games guy that actually has these opinions. In greater percentage. They both do, but in greater percentage.
Yeah, keep in mind, it's fallen across the board in every single one of these, right? But it's fallen more with men that are social, that do go on dates, that don't overconsume, online content and stuff like that. Which, again, was entirely antithetical to what the expectation was from progressives when they were doing these type of surveys. Now, there's another component here on the social side that I think is really going to drive home, the whole argument that men and women might be viewing each other as enemies.
Yeah.
Rudyard Lynch has actually talked about this, but the numbers have been updated. And I think this is the third time in today's podcast where I'm like, this is going to shock you. I have not even shown Nick this before. He doesn't even know what he's about to see. Take a look at this. Over 50% of men under the age of 30 are virgins.
Huh.
At an all-time high.
So, but again, that reinforces the idea that, they're all incels. Or it reinforces the idea that they hear that what you have is...
No, because it said that they went on dates. It didn't say that they had sex. It didn't say that they're married or anything like that.
No, but it's... The thing is that there's this interesting dynamic that's taking place right now. Like, one of the frustrations that kept getting mentioned was that 70% of the women were sleeping with 20% of the guys. And
now none of the guys are sleeping with anyone.
Well, the argument was that the problem this was creating within hookup culture was this idea that all the women are sleeping with a relatively small group of guys. And then what ends up happening is when a woman sleeps with maybe a guy that's out of her league, this is the theory, that she thinks that's what she can get to actually marry her or form a committed relationship with her. And that's not the reality. And so that was something that would explain this. It's like, the explanation was, you have, because women are more sexually liberated now, and because they're all going for the quote unquote top tier guys, that's who's getting all the action, right? That was the argument. But there appears to be something else going on here that doesn't explain as neatly as it used to. And if we want to go back to the other chart, I think we might have something of an explanation there.
This one?
Yeah. So if we scroll down more, okay.
There was no correlation for absent fathers.
Yeah, no.
There was not really correlation on education.
Yeah.
A little bit on parenting styles, actually.
Yeah, there was.
This was interesting. The percentage who said that they can't talk to their parents about everything versus those who can.
Yeah.
Those who can't actually fell further.
Yes.
Which was a bit interesting. But then
the
the strongest
biggest one
is religion.
Religion. For those that considered religion very important, it dropped off significantly under both categories.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I would love to see a correlating chart that was arranged exactly the same way as that last chart, to show, because young men are really flocking to religion at this point. I mean, it's specifically the more traditional kind of Catholic religion or Catholic denomination, Orthodox. There's a big shift to a very traditional form of Christian religion.
Yeah. And the only reason I wanted to bring that up is go back to the other chart about people identifying as virgins.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
I mean, it's exploded.
If you start to see, well, again, if you look at 1989 to 2008, it was flat for most, or it was kind of up and down, but within the 10 to 20. I mean,
it was really
the vast
low.
majority of men had again had a sexual partner before they were 30. It starts to increase in 2008. You see this big shift between 2016, like from 2008 to 2018, and then it steadily goes up over the next several years. Now you can throw COVID in there, you can throw other things in there, but what I think is also interesting is I don't know the answer. I don't know how much of this return to this idea of traditional religious beliefs has caused men to essentially abstain.
I think we're putting the cart before the horse. I think.
Well, no, wait. I'm not saying that's the conclusion. I'm saying I don't know how that factors in. I also don't know how things like incredible access to pornography factors in.
But that's also shown to be on decline. And then also,
but recently.
Okay, but can I also point out too that the age of young men getting married has also gone higher.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe
they're just not hanging out with women as I don't know what to tell you guys. Like they're not in relationships with women. They can sometimes go on dates, but you know what happens? They go on a date with a woman and they realize the woman is nuts, and then they don't go on another date with her. And then they go and report when they get surveyed, yeah, I've been on a date. I hated it. Women are crazy and I want to take their rights away.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm just telling you what's happening. That's
well, how many dates have you been on where you thought the woman was nuts, and that's why you?
Well, to your point, I haven't been on a date since I was in high school.
Exactly. So we don't know how these dates are actually going.
We had there was this conversation in our circle community. I'm shilling for our community here.
Yeah.
Somebody was having a conversation about topics similar to this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually a friend of ours that's also in our Minecraft community. I think it was Sam who was, talking. He was replying to somebody, and Sam's a younger guy. He's in the UK, much younger than me. He's like 10 years younger than me. And, he was like talking about his interactions with women. And I replied to him and I'm like, you know how I fix this problem? I just don't talk to women. It had like 30 people liking that comment.
Uh-huh. Well, so again,
well, I mean,
I think there's a lot of guys that are in that boat where they're like, here, I'm exaggerating to a degree.
But women are kind of at the same, they're also not liking how men's minds are. So men
that's my point. They're shifting apart.
Men are no longer liking how women's minds work. Recognizing women and men are very different, and they have to be. There is this idea that men would much prefer women to be beautiful versions of men, mentally. So they want the aesthetics of the woman, but they would rather her mind work like a man's. It's just easier to deal with. But it doesn't. And then women also want men to be mentally feminine.
So speaking of the difference between men and women,
but looking visually good as a man, right? And so it's almost like we have no tolerance for the differences in how our minds work anymore.
Well, so hang on. You're jumping ahead again, just a little bit. Because
let's not spend 45 minutes on the framing then. Let's get moving.
No, we're getting into the perspectives here. I mean, I was trying to share a perspective a minute ago, somewhat hyperbolic, but I do think that what has happened is that sometimes men, they do go on, it's not like dating's completely dead, but what happens is that in that 18 to 30-year-old bracket, a man can go on a date with a woman. It goes horribly for a variety of reasons, many of which might be because of politics or theology or something cultural. And then he's like, this is not for me. Women are crazy, and I want to take their rights away when they get polled. I'm going to become massively more right wing. And we also saw, though, that those who don't go on dates have also moved to the right, but it's those who interact with women have become more right wing. How can both be true? How can those who interact with women shift further to the right at the same time that male virginity in the 18 to 30-year-old bracket is, at an all-time high? Show me at any point in history where an absolute majority of 18 to 30-year-old men are virgins. Mm-hmm. This period here from 1989 to 2008 is almost a 20-year period.
Yeah.
From 2008 to today is also almost, not quite, a 20-year period. So from 1989 to 2008, it shifted 1% from 7%. That's really low, really low, to 8%. Really low still. That's a whole generation, a 20-year, almost a 19-year period. From 2008 to today, which is, that's like 17 years, something like that. Mm-hmm. It went from 8% to north of 50%. Mm-hmm. You tell me what has happened. At the same time,
men and women are somehow not attracted to each other anymore.
They hate each other. I don't know what else to say.
Well, and it used to be that there was at least sexual gratification that could, spark something. And at this point, not even the idea of sexual gratification is inducing these people to.
They're being turned on. I've gone to put a bow on this segment. I've shown you guys 3 important things. I showed you party identification and stratification between men and women, all-time high among the youngest crowd, 18 to 29-year-old. Biggest gender divide of any group in America at any point in time. And that women, young women, 18 to 29-year-old women, are more to the left than any other group in America, whereas 18 to 29-year-old men are arguably more to the right than any other group in America. Yeah. And that 18 to 29-year-old men have shifted harder to the right than any other group. That's the first thing I showed you. Second thing I showed you was these basic questions about like gender equality and feminism, all-time low for 8th to 10th grade boys. And that the biggest drop-offs were among men who did go on dates with women. Yeah. But it's down across the board. And then the last point that I showed you is that male virginity in among the 18 to 30-year-old crowd, who historically are not known for being virgins, is at an all-time high where an absolute majority of them are virgins. All 3 of those points are completely unprecedented if you go any further back than like 10 years or 15 years.
And there's one thing I want to be careful about here, because I've always had this problem with this idea of like, oh my gosh, more men are virgins. What a horrible thing. And I'm like, my first question is, are they married? Because if they're not, that's not a bad thing. And I think we need to make a distinction here.
They're definitely not married.
Well, there you go. Right. That's another.
Well, it doesn't say unmarried.
Wait a second.
It says.
Okay, but that can be safely assumed that if you're married, you're probably having sex.
Hold on. I'm talking about the graph itself just says men under 30 who report 0 female sex partners since they turned 18.
Sure, but Tina, we know that 18 to 30-year-old men are getting married at a much reduced rate versus, say, the boomer generation.
Yeah. So my point is that I just want to make a clear distinction before we move into asking questions about like why some of this is going on, right? But
I am so sorry, but I'm trying to say the reason that matters is because you've got this very high percentage of men obviously now unmarried, whereas before that number might be lower because men were marrying younger.
Yes.
That's all I'm trying to say.
No, I think that's fair. I think one of the things that we look at is because marriage has been delayed, more people are not, having sex or is not as sexually active in that, or at least more men. The only distinction I want to make, okay, is if you're a man and you're not married, you being a virgin is not a bad thing. Okay, it's not a bad thing. You shouldn't be going out there racking up body counts. Like, you shouldn't be doing that. That is bad. That is not good for you. That is not good for her. It's fine. The problem, though, comes when you do the overlapping thing where it's like, no, these young men want to get married. They can't get married. And now the enticement of even maintaining a relationship with a woman for the promise that you might get to have sex is not even sufficient to cause them to either look for those dates or go into those relationships because there is a heightened degree of like animosity between men and women. At the same time that you have an explosion of, and now this is the part where I'm going to really get controversial, LGBTQ, right? And at the same time, you also have an explosion of pornography, which impacts both men and women. So there's all these other things that are factoring into this, but all of them are there. The question is, as we look at this massive divide between men and women, from the women's perspective, why is this happening? Why does there seem to be this overall general animosity toward men? And I want to ask Tina first, for obvious reasons. Why do you think that there's this overall animosity among younger women toward men?
Okay, before I answer that question, I'm going to point out one more thing. Is the average age of a man getting married in 1980 was 24.
Yeah.
The average age now for a man to marry is 30.2.
Yeah.
So we have a 6-year shift, all in your 20s, that no longer, like men are no longer on average getting married before 30. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that still plays a massive part when
I agree.
Before that, there was 6 years of marriage time before. I mean, when average was 24, that is a really big difference.
I don't think anyone disagrees with you. I agree with you.
Okay,
I think that does explain part of what's going on.
Right.
But then what it doesn't explain,
the shift toward religion for men.
But then what also needs to be asked though is why aren't they getting married younger?
Okay. So, and part of that would be, so now you've got men who are becoming more religious, okay? And they want a certain type of wife. It's not that they don't want to get married, but when they do, they want a certain type of wife. Well, those women aren't sleeping with them. The ones they want are not sleeping with them either. And so that also plays a factor. Like a guy that wants a virtuous woman is not getting a woman who sleeps with people, right? Because he wants a virtuous woman. So they're both waiting at that point. And yeah, maybe those women are harder to find. One of the reasons why I think that there is a disconnect is because I think whereas people used to be, okay, so you know how marrying outside of your religion, unequally yoked, is a recipe for disaster. Yeah. You know, it just doesn't work. In fact, in the Bible, it says not to do that. You don't marry people. If you're a Christian, you don't marry someone that's a non-Christian. You do not have clearance to do that biblically. You don't have clearance as a Christian woman to marry a Muslim man biblically. Outside of your religion, you do not have biblical clearance to do so. And I believe that because leftism has become in and of itself sort of a religion, it has become insurmountable now to marry or date someone outside of your political persuasion because the religious element is so closely linked. It used to be that it was not that uncommon to find that there was a man who was a Republican and a woman who was a Democrat, and they were married and they could make it work. That does not exist anymore because the two political persuasions are so far in opposite directions. One of them is fine with chopping healthy body parts off of children and murdering your offspring, and the other wants to preserve life and preserve what is natural. They cannot coexist well within a relationship without causing explosive disagreements. And so I think that, for instance, like if I were single and in my 30s, I would absolutely never date a leftist man. He would be such a huge turnoff to me. It'd be revolting. And I believe that men are looking at women now the same way. The immediate gratification or payoff of sex or whatever her body can offer you is not worth the absolute repulsiveness of her mindset now.
Let me ask another question here, because I think that makes a lot of sense, right? It's the ideological divide, especially on issues that people consider to be like core to their identity. There's a number of things we can potentially disagree with, like on tax rates or speed limits, right, which are not core to our identity. But when it does come to issues like the life issue, when it comes to these things become significantly more important and something you're not willing to part with, nor are you willing to enter into in-depth relationships with another person. There's another question I want to ask, and that has to do with kind of the Me Too concept. So one thing that has kind of risen simultaneously on this is at the same time that sexual liberation or promiscuity became more acceptable among women, so too did kind of the legal structure, especially around the Me Too movement, where now regret could equal sexual assault, right? And like I remember when the whole thing happened with Justice Kavanaugh, where all of a sudden you got this guy going for the Supreme Court, and this woman comes up and says, "Oh my gosh, 30 years ago," and I remember being at a restaurant, and there was a table of women behind me. And one woman said, "So you're telling me that someone could come back 30 years late? So you're telling me that my son could go have a consensual relationship with someone, and if she decides she doesn't like it, that's it, his life is ruined and he's going to jail?" And I remember that being an interesting moment for me, because I had been so used to this idea of the whole concept of believe all women, that now I was listening to women going, no. It was the first time I can remember women saying, like, coming out just in casual conversation, not the typical pundits you would expect, but just women having breakfast saying, "You're telling me my entire son's life can be destroyed, not because he did anything wrong, but because a woman just made an accusation."
Well, and I think that women had an issue with that as well, because not to be anti-woman or mean to women, but I have known and seen plenty of women who were perfectly fine lying about a man doing something to her, or exploding it in her mind and being like calling something that word that wasn't really that word. She, there were some people that were like, "Oh, women wouldn't just make that up." I'm like, you don't know women. Mm-hmm. You don't know women. If you think women wouldn't make that crap up, you don't know women.
Well, and again, there's this thing that, obviously, one of the things that I think did come out as we looked at the whole Me Too movement, the positive aspect side, was this idea that there were a lot of women that have been put in incredibly compromising situations, or had been, essayed when they were younger or whatever it was, and it had an impact. And that was something that those were stories that needed to be told, and those were statistics and numbers that people needed to be able to identify and grasp and understand the depth of a problem. By the same token, what I'm getting at here, and again, I've been married since I was 19, but Christian, you've been, in the environment where you're not married, you would like to get married at some point. It seems to me too, if you're a young man and you're looking at this going, man, the cost benefit, and even if you didn't have a moral inclination, like let's say you didn't have any religious belief that said, look, I'm not supposed to have sex outside of marriage.
It's dangerous for you.
You're looking at, it's like, okay, she may be fine right now, but if she has any regret later, or I find out that she has a boyfriend and now all of a sudden she's got to explain to her boyfriend what happened, I'm going to be the bad guy and she's going to be believed and I'm going to be ruined. And even if it comes out later that she lied, the probability of me being able to recover from that goes down significantly. So here's my question, and maybe as you were in high school and with other, I know that you have not been actively going out and trying to seek to date a lot because, but have you seen that as a consideration that young men, because the joke has always been young men don't think that far ahead, right? If they can, but do you think that it has become a serious consideration among young men within the dating market and hookup culture?
I think that both of you guys are in some ways putting the cart before the horse. I said this earlier. I'm waiting for the comments from when this video goes out and people are going to be like, no, Nick and Tina, it's not that religion's driving men to act this way. They're turning to religion in desperation. I think that most men wanted this. I think they wanted this. And they didn't want high church, orthodoxy, Catholicism. They wanted 80s, 90s, early 2000s sexual liberalism and liberation. And I think what happened is that women got turned against men during the Great Awakening and started treating men like enemies and like trash. I mean, go on Twitter and search the phrase "kill all men" or "men are all trash," and go and look at tweets from 2013 to 2018, and you will see hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of tweets from liberal women who were in that age bracket at that time saying this type of stuff. And I think that men, we're not thinking about, oh man, I need to find the most based Christian denomination to be a part of.
Yeah.
I think that men in 2008 to 2018 were thinking, how do I experience this
Yeah.
like my parents did or my grandparents did?
Yeah.
And when they didn't get this because women went insane, then they became more right-wing. Then they became more religious. Then they became more anti-feminist.
So you think it was a reaction?
I think what we are going through right now is literally a right-wing backlash against women treating men like enemies. And I feel like the data here is absolute proof of this, because here's something else for you. When you look at age breakdowns of men and women, gay and straight, who don't have kids but say that they do versus say that they don't, you see something really interesting here. The number of, LGBTQ men and women who don't have kids that say that they do is basically the same as straight women who don't have kids who say that they do. There's only one group in here that's an outlier that say that they want to have kids who don't, and it's straight men. And it's an
Under 50.
absolute majority, 54% of them who say that they do. And when you compare this to this, the male virginity chart, to the previous stuff that we were talking about here about, men adopting, somewhat reactionary views about feminism, I compared to, the partisan gap and then the voting gap, like I feel like all this data is converging to a really simple explanation, which is that men were sold kind of a lie in terms of you can live you're in early 2000s, right? You can live that 90s lifestyle of somebody who was in their teenager, early 20-something, age bracket in, say, 1992.
Yeah.
You, the, 2017, 2018 man, can experience what it was like to be an 18-year-old guy in 1992, except, actually, you can't, because the women are crazy. And
so okay, it's very easy and a little bit flippant to say because the women are crazy.
They are crazy.
Okay. Well, then here's what I'm going to ask.
A bunch of comments.
Here's what I'm going to ask you to do then, is that actually explain what you mean by that.
Here's what I mean. And this is very counterintuitive. But I think that there is a natural inclination. Remember that video that I played earlier, the Ezra Klein interview?
Yeah.
The guy that he was talking to is a Democrat pollster, and he said, historically, center-left parties, he's talking about his party, right? Did better with men than women.
Yeah.
And that's actually true until you get to about the 70s to the 90s when it zeroed out and then inversed, where women became much more left-wing and men started to become slightly more right-wing. Well, I think the reason for that is quite simple. Women were voting for more right-wing parties or center-right parties until the 70s because women are always inherently more conservative than men. And so what happened from, say, the turn of the century, actually, you could go back to before women's suffrage. Women historically were more prominent within the church. Even if they didn't hold leadership positions, they attended church more often than men. They supported, social norms and stability more often than men. They were traditionally more supportive of things like prohibition, right? They were a larger representation within the teetotaling movement. They were more conservative than men. They were more religious. They were more traditionalist. They were more conservative than men around the turn of the century. And I let alone go even further back than that. And so what happened when women were given the vote? What did they do? They voted more conservatively. They voted to uphold society's social norms, the political theology that governed the civilization that they were a part of. Well, now ask yourself, what does it mean to conserve something today versus conserve something in 1900? What are they conserving today? They're still conservatives today. You know what they're doing, though, is that they're conserving progressivism. They're no longer conserving the old order, but they're conserving an order. They're conserving the current social order because women always conserve the current social order. And so the impulse that drives women to be young women, to be, gender goblins, blue hair, all the stereotypes, right? To fall into the Great Awakening. The impulse that drives women to defend the Great Awakening is the same impulse that drove women to defend prohibition, to defend religious structures, to vote for center-right parties 100 years ago.
Okay, but at some point there was a departure because
it became unmarried from morality. And there was a sexual liberation period, which absolutely... So this kind of also goes back to... it was generally accepted for men to be promiscuous in the past. And it was generally unacceptable for women to be promiscuous in the past. There was at some point a crossroads where, especially during the temperance movement, where men were basically asked to be more virtuous by their women. And instead, it was offered through probably licentious, progressive thinking men at the time, because men were the ones who did most of the thinking back then. Well, for public consumption. It was offered that, look, we're not going to hold men up to this standard, but we could easily let you now join us in this more promiscuous lifestyle. And, and that's where a lot of the abortion stuff really started kicking off. That's where a lot of the birth control started kicking off. So it was women were offered the same type of licentiousness that men had been able to enjoy before. Hold on. And women, rather than continue the struggle to pull men toward virtue, were willing then to join men in the licentiousness. And I'm not saying this in absolutes. I'm just saying generally as a society, that's kind of the way the leading was. And women followed men into that. And now women have gone so far off the deep end, the pendulum swinging back. Men are repulsed by that now. And they realize they miss that. They miss what women used to be. And now men are trying to pull the other direction. And eventually, my prediction is they will pull women with them. Men are, instead of leading them down the promiscuous route of licentiousness, men are now recognizing that they are repulsed by the results of that. And they are now leading the other direction. Women will take a while to follow, but they will follow. And that's what I believe. Well, and I think a lot of that makes sense. I think one of the reasons why we could probably track this down on where was this departure, where was this break that took place. I think it probably came from a lack of protein. And that's where Good Ranchers comes in. Because if you don't want to be the sort of person that has to preside over a fallen nature where men and women hate each other and are no longer willing to come together and build strong families, the kind that we need for strong communities and a strong country, well, then you need to go check out Good Ranchers. Because Good Ranchers is not only the sponsor of today's episode, they are also the people that will deliver to you the best American-raised beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood directly to your door. And if you go to goodranchers.com and you use my exclusive code Nick, not only are you going to get everything I just mentioned, but they're going to give you $40 off your order, plus free meat with your subscription. We consume Good Ranchers on, an almost daily basis in the Freitas household. And guess what? We love each other. Am I saying that Good Ranchers is responsible for happy marriages and can completely turn all of this around in our country? I'm not saying that. It helps if you get enough meat.
So go to goodranchers.com, use my exclusive code Nick, and check them out. And it's a great way to, again, not only help a great company, not only help yourself, but also to support the show. So go check out goodranchers.com. Okay.
So a competing theory to that.
Okay, so real quick, just so we can sum that up. Tina's theory was essentially that what you actually happen is, like, for the vast majority of human history, women and men played these respective roles. Now, one of the things that was a societal norm and what was generally more acceptable was men were more promiscuous, but a woman's virtue was absolutely essential to her character. And so there was this push. You saw this within like the Prohibition era and whatnot, where you did have problems with like rampant alcoholism. You had problems with men not providing for their families. And so you did have this temperance movement that was taking place simultaneously with a lot of the women's suffrage movement and whatnot, which was this idea that, hey, men, we need you to stand up. We need you to be good, virtuous men. But at the same time, a lot of this was going on, especially in the early 20th century. You had the progressive era, which was also pushing around these notions of kind of generalized liberation, women's liberation. And so the argument I think you're making is, at the same time, a lot of women were asking men to step up and fulfill their proper roles. You had other prominent men and, perhaps women in society saying, no, the solution to this is not for men to be more virtuous. It's for women to become more sexually liberated.
And women were willing to do that. Women were all too willing to go ahead and take that easy route. And one of the reasons I say this is because, look back through history. Brothels did not exist for women to go to brothels and get off. They existed for men.
Yeah.
And they were acceptable for men. And there's definitely a portion of women that probably wanted to be able to do that too. But for the most part, women upheld virtue, and the women who actually worked in those brothels a lot of times did it because sex work is not good work. It's
the other thing too,
they did it out of usually desperation.
The other thing too, the reason why brothels the reason why brothels for men have existed and brothels for women typically don't is because women don't have to pay for it. They pretty much just have to show.
That's not necessarily true.
Oh no,
okay, we're getting way. I built the outline for this, and
All right, so go.
Gosh darn it, we're gonna get through this.
All right, so go ahead.
No, veto. We're moving on. So. Look, here's what I have to do this because we're at an important point in this conversation.
So then do it.
I'll tell you what's happened. The 60s happened. That's what happened. It wasn't the turn of the century. The turn of the century, the women were voting for the right-wing parties. I brought this up in a much older podcast.
Yeah, I talked about the sexual liberation.
Oh my
gosh.
We're
not
okay, let's go ahead.
You know what? Like just a couple years before the Spanish Civil War kicked off, women were voting for CETA. The conservative right-wing party in Spain.
Okay,
this is a universal
we have established
trend.
this. We agree with you. So
what happened after the 60s is that the old traditional order of what society was, kind of the civic religion of the West, the political structure, the theological structure, the social structure, got inverted, and progressivism became the status quo. And so what do women who are natural small c conservatives who uphold and defend the status quo do? Well, they start defending progressivism. Because that's the conservative thing to do, not big C conservative,
with your take
small
completely.
C conservative.
I disagree.
Okay, well, I mean, you're welcome to disagree, but the fact of the matter is that
so wait a second. Let me see if I can, because I feel like to a degree we're talking around each other.
We're proving the point. Men and women are becoming enemies.
Well, I think the argument that you're making is, again, if you don't think of conservatism as a way of protecting a particular viewpoint, a particular worldview, because when we view conservatism in the United States, we generally associate it with traditional values, Christianity, and whatnot. If you just look at conservative as conserving what exists or what has become the social norms, then I think what Christian's arguing, let me finish, please. What Christian is arguing is that when progressivism essentially replaced Christianity or traditional American values, women went into the position of, if this is the new social norm, I'm voting to protect the new social norm. Is that a fair representation of your argument? Okay,
that would
please
work.
Now respond.
That would work if this inversion happened in a vacuum and just suddenly, poof, it was on the scene. But that happened through a process that women were participants in.
They were not participants in. They voted Republican all the way until the late 1970s. Richard Nixon won the female vote in 1960 against Kennedy.
It's not like people just suddenly flipped the vote. What happened was something happened in society to disintegrate what women were working toward and why women did what they did. Something happened to disintegrate this thing, and women participated in that something. I'm not talking about voting numbers. I'm talking about in society, in our culture. That shift happened because of things women and men were both doing that caused it. I'm not talking about her becoming a Republican or becoming a Democrat overnight. The sexual liberation happened. Women were offered like the ability to have sex with anyone and everyone they wanted to, and to shame a woman for being unvirtuous or slut shaming became a bad thing. And now women are having as much sex rampantly with whoever they want, just like the men, because now they can abort their babies, and now they have ways to keep their bodies from getting pregnant. Those are the things that disintegrated, and they fell away from God.
But who drove all of that? It was not a woman that wrote Das Kapital. It was not a woman that wrote the prison notebooks. It was not a woman who was Herbert Marcuse. It was not a woman that was Antonio Gramsci. It was not a woman that was Karl Marx.
So what you're saying is this is all men's fault.
To that guy's point,
yeah,
center-left parties did better with men than women until the 1970s. I'm talking about generalizations here. I'm not saying that there weren't leftist women before the 60s,
sure.
And there were extremely right-wing men before the 60s, obviously. My point is that women were not the drivers of this. They were the passive observers of this. You know, when they had the chance, when they were given the vote, they voted to defend the status. Women have never, ever in American history voted to overturn the status quo. They have always voted to uphold the status quo, whatever that status quo is. They always voted for whoever was representing the current ruling
Popular
social
consensus.
order.
And that
from
might
the moment
be,
they were given the vote
to
this very day, they continue to do that.
Might be because women have an innate need for safety, and it is safer
and stability
to preserve what has been set up than so. And that might be so. What I'm saying is, women went off that direction with men, which you obviously agree with me. They were led that direction by men, and women were all too happy to join them in that. And that is why I'm saying that women, once men reestablish the order, and once men lead them back, women will eventually follow.
We totally agree on that point. We were like hotly debating each other until a second ago. But Tina, I completely agree with you that it's going to be these men, the young right-wing men, that are going to pull women back to the right. And you know what?
Which is why men leading is so important, especially now.
We're seeing it in the polling.
That's something I wanted to bring up, because we've had this argument before. And there was some frustration with me, in part because I certainly didn't express it well and didn't fully understand what the nature of the problem was. But I still always insisted that there is no way through it without men taking a leadership role. It doesn't happen otherwise. My concern was if men kind of sit it out, like if men take this attitude where I will start behaving like the sort of traditional masculine man when it is appreciated again, it won't happen. One has to precede the other.
Well, God made made men to lead.
I understand. Women. The argument that I'm making is that what I kept trying to articulate to young men was that it sucks to not be appreciated to fulfill your God-given purpose within society. It sucks. You want to be appreciated for it. I was just talking to a group of young men the other day, and the thing that I emphasized to them, I said, you've seen that cycle, right? It's good men create good time, or hard men create good times create weak men create bad times. And then it says bad times create hard men. I said, I need you to understand that last one isn't true. What happens is hard times once again remind us all of the virtues of hard men. I said, but if you don't choose to be the sort of man that steps up, you can spend a lot of time in the darkness. You can spend a lot of time in the wilderness. So it's important to understand that it's not that it creates you into the sort of hard man that is needed in those particular times. It's that the virtues of that are once again rewarded within society. And it's a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing that we have to rely on the hard times to properly prioritize and properly elevate the virtues that we need in good men and good women, by the way. The key has always been, how do we get to the good times and remember what got us there in the first place and then work to maintain it? And that's more difficult because with good times generally comes wealth, prosperity, security, complacency, decadence, degeneracy. And the next thing you know, you're right back to this hard cycle. And so I do think when I see the conversation that again you guys were just having, which I think is really an interesting one because I've never viewed it from the position you were before. I don't know that I would use conservative, even though I understand why you did. I think maintaining the status quo is important.
As soon as he swapped the language out for maintaining the status quo and basically preserving that, I just couldn't get my brain around the conserving part. And so I will say you won me over on that.
So, but the thing I want to bring up here that I do think is interesting because something unique happened, right? Like you said, I know it might seem to people watching this that we always kind of go back to Marxism or whatnot, but it's because it explains a lot of where we're currently at. Because if you do adopt this view of a hyper-egalitarian society, and the reason why I'm going back to this hyper-egalitarianism is because the nature of the question they asked those boys from 8th to 10th grade was important. It was, a woman should have the same job opportunities as a man, and men and women should be paid the same money if they do the same work. In a very egalitarian society, this is not only kind of an obvious, socially safe answer to say, yes, of course. It's almost a moral precept. It's a part of the catechism. Of course you have to say this because if you don't, you're a bad person. And what's interesting is that on some level, if you look at this question, should a woman should have the same job opportunities as a man? Okay. I would say that's generally true, in my opinion. It's not absolutely true. I'm sorry. I don't believe that it is a good thing overall for women to serve in certain combat roles. I just don't. That's now considered a very old-fashioned view. On the other one is men and women should be paid the same money if they do the same work. Again, that one's a little bit more confusing, right? Because do they do the same work to the same degree? Do they achieve the same outcome? Here's what I think young men are rejecting these questions now is because they believe they're loaded. They no longer see them. They no longer look at that question and say, I'm going to analyze the question in which in the spirit in which you asked it. Excuse me, in the context of which you asked or what those words actually mean. I know what you actually mean. And so my answer is no.
They're not neutral questions anymore.
They're not neutral questions anymore. And I think this is important because it's 8th, 9th, and 10th grade boys that are saying it's not a neutral question. This should be obvious. Let me put it this way. For anybody that generally believes in fairness, if theoretically, if I do the same job for the same number of hours and achieve the same result, of course my pay should not be determined by whether or not I'm a man or a woman. But they know that's not what they mean. And what you're starting to see now is that even though you could make an argument that the answer to that question should be yes, provided we share the same worldview, we know we don't anymore. And so I'm going to answer no to your question. And I'm going to put it in your face. And I know what you're going to do. You're going to call me evil. You're going to call me a misogynist. And I don't care. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. One, it's because the rebellion is now, it is now happening, right? It is one thing for someone that's maybe in their late 20s, early 30s or higher who has been seeing this going on and who is frustrated by it and who can articulate all the various points and who can draw it back to Herbert Marcuse and Simone de Beauvoir and all these. The kid in 10th grade, the average kid answering this in 10th grade doesn't know all of that, but they know something's crap. They know something's wrong and they know they're rejecting it. And what the answer to that question signifies is they're willing to accept a certain degree of social hostility to reject it. That's rebellion.
Yeah.
The question now.
There was also the question where it says, can you talk to your parents freely?
Yeah.
The ones who felt they could not talk as freely with their parents are the ones rebelling the most in this area.
Because their parents are also liberals.
Yep.
Right. And so basically, you're a rebel now if you're on the right.
Yeah.
This is why those Zoomers, 18 to 20 something year old crowd is men in that age group, is the most right wing generation that anybody in this country alive, I think. I really do believe this, that 18 to say 25 year olds men are the most right wing group that any living person in this country has ever witnessed ever.
Yeah.
Like when I have conversations with men in that age range on the internet and they share their genuine views on how society, if they were in charge, how society would be ordered. I kind of can't believe myself sometimes when I hear it. Sometimes I'm like, damn, you're more base than I am.
Well, and sometimes, and let's be honest.
Sometimes you're more dangerous.
Sometimes it's like that's going in a very dark direction. And this does come to the question, because I think more and more what people are realizing is, again, the hyper egalitarian, the idea that everything's equal. That's going away. And again, I think when we looked at equality before, like when you look at equality from a biblical perspective, equality is this idea that you have equal value to the extent that you're created in the image of God, right? That there is an equality that exists there, a moral equality that exists there by virtue of your existence and the nature of your creation. But there isn't this expectation that we all have the same talents, abilities, goals, purpose, roles, responsibilities. There's nothing really like that. There may be certain things that are shared virtues that you should exhibit, whether you're a man or a woman. You should be honest. You should be truthful. You should be loyal. You should be all these things. Absolutely. But that was rejected, openly rejected by the Marxist worldview. And the rejection, we think of like Marxism as in economic terms, but it's like, no, they rejected the family. They rejected husband and wife. They rejected the way that you raise kids. They rejected all of that. And whether or not people adopted Marxist ideology, it ended up being that a lot of the terminology, a lot of the concepts of equality and egalitarianism ended up infiltrating Western thought, regardless of whether or not they accepted the economic circumstances. Why? Well, because there is an inherent sense of us desiring fairness. And I think this is important because if you don't understand fairness within the proper context, it leads you to the world of fairness equals the same. It equals equal access to opportunities, to wealth, to property, and if you don't have equal distribution of these things over here, then something is unfair. Well, it is not a huge jump to say, you know what's unfair is women can get pregnant. That means that they can't be fully equal with men because they can't go out and experience the same things, whether it be occupationally, whether it be socially, whether it be sexually, without being subjected to certain consequences which uniquely impact them. And so in order to achieve equality among the sexes, things like birth control, abortion, these all of a sudden got elevated to, they were no longer, oh, well, this is an unfortunate thing. No. It became like a rallying cry. It became, this is what gives us this level of equality. The same thing that I think Tina kind of talked about earlier, when it's this idea that women are by their very nature more vulnerable within society and within nature than men are, generally speaking. And so where did women traditionally find safety and security? Family and marriage. Family, marriage, and to some degree the tribe.
Or the church too.
And the church, absolutely the church. One of the things that, again, Marxism and hyper-egalitarianism did was it said, no, you're no longer going to find it in the men because they're the source of the problem. You're no longer going to find it in the church because that's just fairy tales are also a source of the problem because it elevates men as playing a leadership role within society and within the church. You're going to find it through the government. The government is going to be the one that's providing provision and protection. So that if you need to leave your husband, and what did they pick as the use case for this? They picked the abusive husband. They picked the most sympathetic use case possible. You need to provide a mechanism whereby a woman can take herself, potentially her children, leave, and still find security. Because if she doesn't have security within the marriage, where's she supposed to get it? Well, the answer to that question used to be within the church or the broader community. Essentially, there were different levels, right? If the husband failed in his responsibilities, the father could be there, or the church could be there, or the larger community could be there, but that was still all dependent upon a certain type of masculinity that saw its duties and responsibilities to protect the vulnerability of women. Government was very easily able to point at the various places where that failed and offer itself as the alternative. But you'll notice that it never points to its own failures. Never points to its own failures. And so I can understand from a female perspective, especially if you were raised in this from a very young age, where it was the idea that you cannot depend on a man because men leave or men drink or men abuse or men hit or men whatever, right? And you can't depend on the church because after all, they allowed predators to exist within the church and didn't do anything about it. Or they knew she was getting beat, and what man from the church showed up to stop it? And so if you're saying I've been failed by the individual men in my life, maybe it was a father, maybe it was a boyfriend, maybe it was a husband. If the institutions which were supposed to step in and protect me or save me from that failed to do so, well, then the government always ends up being the last resort. And then the question becomes well, if there is no higher authority, right? If there is no God, if the church cannot be dependent on, if men are the source of the problem, well, all that leaves me with is a government apparatus. What are my other alternatives? What are my other options? The problem is that anybody that is willing to take a very, very close look at how government has tried to fulfill that role will find that it has led to far worse circumstances on the whole than theoretically what it was supposed to be preventing. Now, that's the part that will be debated. But the thing that we now recognize is that young men are saying, I'm no longer going to be the kicking, the whipping boy for all of this. I'm no longer going to do it. And we knew this was going to happen because at some point you can only sit there. It is a luxury idea for Cher to sit there in an interview and be like, what do we need men for? How about building and protecting your societies? Because last time I checked, we don't typically fight wars with young women. We don't typically fight them with old men either. We don't typically police the streets with young women. That's not to say that women don't try to fulfill these roles, but try to do it exclusively. If you wanted to fight wars or protect streets or fight fires with exclusively young men, you could. If you try to do it with exclusively young women, you could not. And so it was only a matter of time before young men looked around and said, wait a second. No. I don't get relegated to the sidelines. The question now is, will they choose restoration or revenge? And we don't know the answer to that one yet. I'm fighting for restoration. And I think Tina is absolutely right when she says, and it goes into what you were saying about protecting the status quo. One of the reasons why we're seeing an R+14 shift in young women toward more conservative ideas is because you're seeing an R+44 shift in young men. Mm-hmm. Right? You would not see one without the other. You wouldn't. And so what does this say? Does it say that, well, men's job is to lead within society and women are supposed to be relegated to the sidelines? Not in my worldview. But I'll tell you what it absolutely means is men do have a leadership role to play within society. Period. And
can you
this
share
does not denigrate women's place in society. But what it does is it's a rejection of a hyper-egalitarian worldview which says if we're not equal in all things, something is unjust. And now what you're seeing is people return to this idea of no, we are equal in some things, we are not equal in others. And it does not change the overall value of someone based on being a man or a woman. But what it does do is it once again puts things within the proper order, which is to say that generally speaking, men and women had different roles and responsibilities to each other, to a marriage, to their kids, to society. And we don't want to hear that. Well, young men are saying, you're going to hear it one way or another. And the argument is going to be what is going to guide them in making that determination on what those roles and responsibilities should be? Are we going to get to a place where, once again, we understand that this is not about excluding women from all roles within society and allowing men to completely dominate, but it is about respecting a leadership role that men can, will, and must play. And if we recognize that masculinity, the way it's intended, is what actually creates the safe space for femininity to be able to flourish, if we can do that, then we can come out of this better than what I grew up with. Like, that's the bright side of this story. We can have something better than what I grew up with, and what I grew up with was pretty good. But if we don't, if we go in a different direction, the thing I like to remind the progressives is they're not coming for me. They're not coming for me. But they will come for the people that they saw as putting them in this box and kicking them down. And anybody that they associate with being allied with that sort of worldview or thinking, the consequences can get pretty dark pretty quick.
I don't believe that we can actually have restoration without something that progressives would say, no matter what, is revenge.
Oh, they would, yes.
And I think that that's kind of what the issue is. It was really easy for us to get to this point in a way. Undoing, repealing the 60s, basically, on this, right? You know, I said earlier that women are naturally defenders of the status quo. The status quo changed in the 60s from traditionalism to progressivism being the status quo, the cultural status quo. And so women, after the 60s, increasingly voted in defense of the new status quo, which was progressivism. Progressivism is the new conservatism. How do you get, in a way, I say small c, you get what I mean. It is the new thing to defend, the new thing to preserve, the new thing to conserve. How do you undo that without something that looks, certainly from the progressive standpoint, like revenge?
I think the important part to understand is that it is not.
I don't think it's possible.
Well, no, it's not.
They're gonna say
I can't affect the way that they interpret what's going to happen, because they're not wrong in the sense that what I'm looking to do is dismantle the world order they've created. Absolutely. I don't want to peacefully coexist with a hyper-egalitarian neo-Marxist feminism. I don't want to coexist with that. I want to defeat it.
Revenge is a worldly concept. Revenge is the devoid of God aspect, or devoid of God avenue to take. And there will be plenty who take it, because there are plenty who do not yield their life to Christ. But those who have yielded their life to Christ, if you are in obedience, you cannot go and seek revenge and still be obedient to Christ. So what it's going to take are Christian men to yield to Christ and lead us out of this. And there was a stat I wanted you to mention in the last little bit that you said, but I'll have you mention it now, is Nick, share the number of women that are able to, like a woman who finds Christ, is how often she's able to lead her husband to Christ versus a man who finds Christ and is able to lead his family to Christ. The difference is outrageous, and it just goes to show you that men are meant to lead. What is it?
I don't remember off the top of my head like the exact numbers. I want to say it was something like, let me finish. Let me lead you in this conversation. I want to say it was like a woman will oftentimes lead her husband and family to the church about 15% of the time. Mm-hmm. For a man, it's more like 70 to 80% of the time. So
it is a huge difference.
So essentially, let's say you have two people that get married, neither one of them are Christian. If the man becomes a Christian, 70 to 80% chance the whole family becomes Christian. The woman becomes Christian, about 15 to 20% the family becomes Christian.
I believe that.
So,
but that is why I'm saying it's going to take those men. It's going to take them to do it. And like, women can't dig us out of this. It's going to take men to do it. And it's going to take the men that are willing to not seek revenge in order to do it, but there will be some who do.
There's two other components to this, though, that need to be mentioned. One is, first of all, this is not going to be something where one side, it's going to happen simultaneously. There's going to be the people that look at it from like a biblical masculinity position, maybe a traditional masculinity position, and then there's going to be people who are like, nope, I'm the barbarian now. That is going to happen simultaneously. It's a question of which side gets enough support and wins.
And it's justified. It's what we deserve. Right?
But here's the other thing that I think needs to be mentioned that isn't mentioned enough within the church. The feminism problem is not just a problem outside of the church. It's a problem in the church. It is absolutely a problem in the church. One of the reasons why I was not very strong in my faith when I first went into the military was because I looked around at a lot of the Christian men within the church and I was not impressed. Let me tell you one of the things that I had this theory for a while. And I did one of those things which is a little bit dangerous, which is you attempt to confirm a theory on stage. And so I'm sitting there with a couple hundred, again, young men, average ages of probably about 22. And I said, I have a question for all of you, because we were asking questions about masculinity and we were asking questions about leadership and we were asking those questions. I said, there are 3 things that generally get said about me when I'm introduced to speak to a bunch of people. They are member of the Virginia State Legislature, social media influencer, and Green Beret combat veteran. Which one of those 3 are you most impressed with? And all of them, almost in unison, said Green Beret combat veteran. I said, every time. Why? Because that's the one that indicates to you that if something bad were to go down right now physically, I would have the training and the know-how to do something about it. And there is something inherent about young men that admires that capability. Now point to it in the church.
It's coming back, though.
It is.
It's coming back.
It's coming back in the form of guys like John Lovell, in the form of guys like Chad Robichaud, in the form of guys like Victor Marx. You are starting to see more people stand up that say, no, your job is not just to be nice. Nice guys finish last for a reason, because they should. Your job is to be strong. It is to be noble. And yes, you should be compassionate. And you should be capable of tenderness toward the people that love you and that deserve your protection and consideration. But you should be strong. And the more people that we see standing up within the church that do that, the more you will have people that other young men are willing to actually listen to. And I know this because that's how I felt about it. It was when I started to see other men who were strong men, who were also good Christian men, that I realized this is not an either or proposition. In fact, it's a necessity. All right.
I know that you're wrapping up.
No, we've got to
hard
wrap
drive's
up.
failing. We cannot keep going.
Yeah.
It'll take you like 60 seconds. Last question that I've got for you before we wrap up. Do you think that we can actually get out of this? Or are we going to end up suffering the fate of South Korea here, where they're just enemies, birth rate plummets to 0, and it seems like the society is just kind of imploding in real time?
I think we can get out of it. I honestly
You're that optimistic?
Yeah, because I see the trend. So here's again, when you look at 18 to 29 trends, it looks bad. When you look at 18 to 20 trends, all of a sudden it improves significantly, right? That R+44 trend. And I don't want to make this all about partisan Republican Democrat, because it's not just about that. It's about a return to certain ideals and understandings about reality. It's about a rejection of, again, that hyper-egalitarianism, the replacing with something that is objectively true and objectively moral, and not just arbitrarily up for our interpretation. Right? It's about seeking something transcendent and eternal. And the more young men I see doing that and doing it properly and looking to not only be strong, but to be good, the more confident I have that women will reward that. And it's going to take some time. It will take some sacrifice. That's part of what we, again, this whole concept of the beautiful. The beautiful is not just the aesthetic, the physical aesthetic. The beauty is also recognizing a noble action and a sacrificial action for what it is. And I think the more men that are willing to step up and do that, the more it will be rewarded within society, because there's something written into us by our Creator that yearns for it. All right. That is all the time we have for this episode. Once again, let us know what your opinion are. And by the way, if you would like to be someone that can ask questions, we have a pregame, we have a postgame. The postgame is generally where Tina says about a bunch of things that would otherwise get us demonetized. If you would like to be a part of that experience, go ahead and check out the link in Circle. We'd love for you to come and join our community. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.